Hello everyone, and welcome back to this week's Developer Diary talking about historical Denmark. As the army of time marches ever forward, we now have arrived at the final nation that is going to be covered in the Nordic series, with the previous three already being covered. We've had Finland, which focus tree seemed a little bit short, but had some really great flavour. We've seen Sweden, which seems to be the flagship focus tree and main focus of the DLC, especially when you take into account all the mechanics coming with the DLC. And we've also seen Norway, which didn't leave us with too many surprises, except we're not 100% sure on what a lot of the focuses do. So taking that all into account, let's go see how they handle historical Denmark. So keeping in theme with all the other dev diaries, this one begins by giving us some preamble as to the context of Denmark's situation. We begin by seeing an original version of the focus tree consisting of two focuses, which I don't think made it past the draft phase. The context later provided explains that the reason why Denmark did, I guess, so poorly in World War II, with a peace being declared or a surrender being declared within 2 hours and fighting only going on for 4 hours, is due to the disastrous events of 1864, in which they lost quite terribly to Prussia. Because of this, Denmark felt very insecure without having any guarantees from either the United Kingdom or any of the other Nordic countries forming a Nordic alliance. Being on their own, there was no real reason to kind of fight a lost battle before it had even begun, and so decided to spend the majority of their focus on the welfare state. Being the World War II game that this is, I hope there's going to be opportunities to forsake the historical roots to which we land, and maybe take Denmark in a slightly more defensive position. Before delving into the nature of the focus tree, we get to see some map changes and see some of the states that they've reworked. So what we can see here is that, well, let's actually start with Germany because that's kind of interesting. Schleswig-Holstein, which used to be one state, has now been divided into 2 separate states, which is interesting when you consider that they were earlier talking about Denmark and Prussia's previous confrontation about potentially a very strategic area. Moving on, we see that Jutland, or I guess in this context Jylland, is because they're using the Danish naming convention now, has been divided into a north and south state, the north one being far bigger. And Steland, which was originally just one state, has now been divided into 3, with the central Steland, the smaller one of Fyn, and then on the east, I think is it called like Bornheim or something? Bornheim, I think it's something like that. But the small island on the east has also apparently become somewhat more independent. Also briefly taking note to the increase in victory points that we can see across the map. Small note, I don't see anyone here and I don't see any on the small island, which I've always noticed can be kind of frustrating when you're trying to take a state. Sometimes it doesn't register if they don't have a victory point for you to capture. But nonetheless, it's all changed. In addition, they also note how the crossings have also changed for the Danish belts. They're now happening here on a more horizontal axis from Aarhus, when previously I think they were on a more vertical axis from Aalborg. It might also be worth noting that in terms of the canal here, the Kiel Canal, it used to take this kind of shape, coming through Schleswig-Holstein, and up here we can see that the Danish belt, way further back over here, is now moved over here. In the rework, we can now see that it looks like it's been moved slightly further down and kind of been made more defined with a very clear horizontal then vertical shift. I'm not sure it matters too much to gameplay, the fact that it's basically in the same location, but it's a graphical change which I guess has come part of the splitting of Schleswig and Holstein. In terms of Denmark's starting position, we get this image here. A familiar face is there with the Democratic Party still in power. However, we will note that the country now is on disarmed nation to represent their nation being far less military prepared than they are in the current version of the game, as well as free national spirits, which are definitely not to your liking. You'll also notice there is a balance of power system that comes into play later on. The first national spirit, of a very unfortunate nature, is neglected military, which seems to be in keeping with basically every single one of the Nordic nations. It doesn't feel like any of them are quite prepared for World War II, does it? Still, I don't think this is anywhere near as bad as Norway, and despite the hiccups that may have happened in 1864, I feel like you'll still be able to get past it. Eventually. Next up, we have economic crisis, which is kind of a watered down version of the Great Depression because it hit later, bringing down monthly population, which shouldn't matter too much, but definitely painful in the weekly stability and democracy support, this is probably going to be something you want to get rid of for your historical playthrough. Interestingly, nothing about the economic crisis actually affects the economy or your industry. Just something I noticed there. Kind of interesting. And the last national spirit is very much so impacting your industry with Danish industrial capabilities. For too long, Denmark has been a bit slacking in terms of modernising up their industry, and with the consumer goods factories now stacking up and your factory output being on the decline, this is very much so probably one of the highest ranked things you want to make sure you get in line. Earlier on, we saw note of a balance of power system, and this is what we see it come into fruition with here. It's to do with welfare and warfare, which is, I guess it's interesting wordplay if nothing else. The simple version is there is finite amount of resources and funding at Denmark's disposal, and you're going to have to decide how it's going to be distributed. Historically, it was more so going towards welfare at this point in time, but considering you have the know-how that World War II is on the way, maybe pushing it more towards warfare could work towards your interests. If you choose to go down the path of welfare spending, then your population is on the rise and your research is up, as well as making those also important civ factories, but your actual capability to build up an army and stock the army is going to be much worse. On the flip side, we have maximum military spending, which is, as one might imagine, doing exactly the opposite. Mobilization speed is up, training time is down, and mills and production efficiency is all on the rise. This sounds to me like a classic early game welfare into a late game warfare kind of build. Oh look, all of the advisors are dogs. Aww. The advisors are brought up here to demonstrate, well, I guess not only their existence, but to show you that previously shown when hired, when fired mechanic that I think we saw with, it was either Sweden or Norway, but basically now events can happen when you hire and fire certain advisors. In this case, it's going to shift the balance of power towards you being more of a welfare state or a warfare state. Here we see a dog called Christmas, which gives you recruitable population. I don't think they're going to stay as a dog, but I like to imagine a dog called Christmas. The final thing to talk about before we move on to the focus tree is politics. So the system also comes with the integration of politics in terms of the decisions you find under the balance of power system, as well as I assume decisions that you'll actually just get to choose from in a decision tree, but in this specific instance I think it's to do with the balance of power. Denmark now has a decision called the motion of no confidence, which you'll be able to choose a different leader, and this applies to all of the different parties in the game, to choose who you want to rule instead of the person you're deposing. Worse than that, if you feel like your leader has less confidence going in than, let's say, the lifespan of a lettuce, then you can also push for a motion of no confidence to try and get rid of them and call a snap election. Calling for a snap election will give you the opportunity to try and boost the popularity of one of the other campaigns you see there, Com or Fash or Bonde Party, I guess that's going to be non-aligned, or try and keep some democracy with a new leader, but it's going to be even more chaotic. In truth, this whole system feels like something that could be applied more widely across the entire game. Like any kind of country that's running a democratic system, I could totally imagine an interplay where, assuming there's not scripted elections, this is something that could be integrated. But for the time being, or at least as we see it, this is exclusively for Denmark. Right then, with all our bases covered, we can now take a look at the Danish focus tree. So I'm kind of just going through it as an initial reaction here because, interestingly, I'm wondering if this is the whole focus tree. Usually they kind of block things out or leave things as a mystery, but I don't see anything blacked out. This is going to be the industry tree. This appears to be like the democratic tree, the non-aligned branch, but we also see this branch over here with all the question marks. So just going out on a limb and saying this is probably the alt history path on the side here. How much do we want to bet that this focus here involves conquering all of the Nordic nations and forming a united Nordic country? Just a thought. And on the right we see the traditional army tree, navy tree and air force tree, which we all know. The first branch we're going to take a look at is the industrial branch. And I have to say, it's a nice nifty looking branch. I don't actually hold too much against it. It's pretty straightforward, it's pretty simple, but then again, they don't always have to be ridiculously complicated, as long as it's got a good amount of branching things for you to do. Here we see that things like the Faroe Islands or Bornholm, the small island that has recently been divided, have got some attention, as well as a good chunk here towards Greenland if one is feeling invested. With some of the states now being divided up, I wonder if the implementation is going to be that if Denmark capitulates in a certain manner and you go into a government in exile, is it going to be that the nations such as the Faroe Islands and Bornholm and Greenland are going to be kind of your bases for the government in exile? Obviously Iceland isn't here because, well, they go independent, don't they? So they don't exactly get too much love here. The branch begins by you deciding if you're going to sign the Kanslergarderfolk focus. This is going to take your initial steps towards moving towards the welfare state you know and love, as well as give you a pretty decent advisor when it comes to consumer good factories. The branch continues by giving you more civilian factories and building slots, and working towards getting a nice powerful Danish produce, which should give you some supply consumption, division attrition, and basically give you something that's going to help you in warfare, even though your country is geared towards welfare. On the flip side, you've got the warfare-focused industrial branch, Fortify Our Borders, which is going to be focused on getting your country prepped for the inevitable hell that's on its way. In this you get a decent advisor, not as good as the other one, which gives you some military factory construction speed, as well as construction speed for all the other useful things you might need, such as air bases. The end result of this branch involves forts, military factories, and the improved logistics spirit, giving a similar buff to the previous one, although this one involves a hefty boost towards supply hub construction speed, and goodness knows those supply hubs are just a nightmare to build. Parts of the focus tree down the branch, however, are not mutually exclusive, such as Devalue the Kron, or Krona, hard to say, which will give you buffs towards reduction in consumer goods factories and helping that economic crisis, which is tanking some of your weekly stability. After that, you get the option to trade with Britain or Germany, and we see here the option with trading with Britain, in which, if they accept, you get one off-map civ and a boost towards your industrial capacity as Denmark. It also notes that you unlock Danish trade deal decisions, so maybe we get to see what those interesting trade deals are going to be. Preluding to all of those island focuses we were talking about earlier, we have Connect the Islands, which is a pretty simple focus, which just gives you some infrastructure. Oh, and they also take note that you can also get Niels Bohr as an advisor, who, while I'm not too clear on the history, definitely looks like he's gearing you up for a nuclear-dominated victory. We better keep an eye on this guy. The Expand the Industry focus, shown later, allows you to unlock the ability to develop Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and Bornholm, the wholesome little island. In doing so, you'll get a little building slot on there, which can be repeated 3 times in the case of Greenland. This does ask the question, is Greenland going to be a releasable in the next DLC? Is it though? Greenland releasable? Players Greenland? Just asking. This dev diary is far more focus heavy than the Norway one, isn't it? We're getting a good chunk of information at play. Here we see the Aalborg Portland cement plant, which is going to give you some buffs towards some industrial tech, a civ, and interestingly reminder that the industrial concerns are getting buffed as you go along, which is one of the new mechanics they're introducing with the next DLC. Later on we get to see some of the raw power hidden within Greenland in the form of giving them a civ and 10 aluminium, as well as later on giving them another civ, a decision to expand their mines, and a whole host of resources. That's 12 steel, 6 chromium, 6 tungsten. Yeah, you can live quite happily on Greenland should you find yourself needing to be exiled there. With the industry branch covered, they move on to the military branch, which we saw on the far right side of the tree. Due to Denmark's finite amount of investment into their military, there isn't too much historical pathing that they say they could have done here, so a lot of this is kind of guesswork based upon things they did later on and things they would have done in theory. One of the introductory focuses to said branch includes stockpiling oil, which is to try and help that neglected military, which is, well yeah, neglected, isn't it? It also gives you add war preparations, which should give you some fuel helping, because I do believe Denmark starts with a relatively okay sized navy. Something to note at the end there is it says with fuel storage researched, you get 1 building slot and 1 fuel silo in 2 states. Now the focus does require you to have some core states owned and controlled, so we can only hope it does end up somewhere you want it to be, and Iceland doesn't just transport your factories and fuel silos away. The army side of the branch, they say, is going to mostly involve MIOs, which is one of the new features, and are going to be very defensive in nature. The opening focus, called the... oh, what is that letter? The Heeren reorganization is going to involve you getting some base buffs at the core, nice army experience there, and fixing up that neglected military some more, but additionally giving you a chief of army with the good army experience gain and division org. Note that it looks like at the bottom there, the focus is actually giving your generals experience. I think that's what that is, right? Like the generals are just getting experience through the focus, which is an interesting concept. I actually quite like that. In fact, giving generals experience manually is actually quite a good idea. I'm just thinking that wouldn't it be a good idea, potentially, if in your continuous focuses, there was a new one specifically to like train generals, so you could click it and your generals just passively gain experience every month because that's where you're focusing your things. It would certainly make the grinding for a Chinese level 10 general achievement much easier. But I digress. As we continue on down, we see that those MIOs are going to gain some size, some funding. You can boost them up to make them more defensive, and of course gain mills, because what's the point of building up a military if you can't even get the guns for said military? An inability to speak foreign languages continues to shoot me in the foot. With this focus, Heemvanet, goodness me, which gives you some war support, manpower and army experience, but most importantly unlocks the decisions to deploy the Home Guard in Denmark. Deploying the Home Guard is not just one decision, however, it's actually multiple decisions. By spending a little bit of political power and command power, assuming you're at war, you should be able to spawn up some decent entrenchment speed, division attack, division defense, all the things you need to really make sure they can't push in. Should you find yourself completing all the focuses in the branch, by the end you might end up with a national spirit that looks like that one, giving you multiple defensive bonuses. Yeah, there is a little bit there to do with attack on core territory, but for the most part, you're just trying to keep yourself going. The Navy branch follows an old and familiar format of choosing whether you're going to refit the old ships, modernize the Navy, by going down the path of a smaller Navy that can kind of deal with submarines and whatnot, or a much bigger Navy to try and dominate a wider area. Choosing to go down the refit purpose actually gives you quite a very well stacked focus here. Goodness me, you get funding for your Navy industrial designer, you gain decisions to refit convoys for military purpose, and to purchase older ships from great powers, another feature that keeps rearing its head. It's almost to the point now that I think that purchasing ships from other nations is almost should be globally available, but that's just my opinion. Industrial capabilities for Denmark is always on the rise. 4 research bonuses, just 4 of them. You finally get a nice chief of navy, not the most powerful, but a decent one all the same, as well as 2 dockyards. Now if that isn't a stacked focus, I don't know what is. We get to see what the powerful might of refitting ships actually is later on, and in its current version, oh my goodness, it looks giga-powered. For 10 convoys, you get 1 destroyer. What? Coming in at 7 destroyers a year, and also wondering if you can do that with the cruisers, which we see at the top, but we don't know how well that works. That could be a pretty powerful Denmark Navy. Honestly, who cares about Jutland and Sjælland at this point? We're just going to Greenland. We're taking all our stuff to Greenland. We're taking the ships to Greenland, building our fuel silos. We live in Greenland now. It also said we have the option for naval procurement by buying ships, assuming that we're on good terms with the United Kingdom. We can try and get some, but we're not quite sure what that would entail. If all those buffs weren't to your liking, although personally getting 7 destroyers a year just for some convoys is very much so to my liking, but if that wasn't to your liking, you can try and modernise your navy, which does also have a pretty stacked focus. In this one, instead of getting decisions to buy ships, you get given some pretty decent designs for you to start building some decent ships immediately. Once you've completed the military branch for the army on the left and the navy branch in the middle, once you've chosen if you want to go down Baltic Sea domination and completed the army branch, you unlock this focus here, which goodness knows I can't pronounce. Here we see the focus in its truth, where we get massive buffs towards invasions. So the prep time's down, the penalty's down, which is to my mind the best part, and your capacity is only slightly up, with the invasion speed also being made faster. I guess this is a good focus to take into consideration if you do find yourself as a government in exile and you want to go home. you're tired and you want to go to bed. And you had a little drink about an hour ago, and it's gone straight to your head. If going for that focus was not to your desire, then you can go for something which is frankly far more ambitious. North Sea ambitions. With this focus, and again it's a mega stacked focus again, we're going to see buffs all across the board towards some of your biggest ships, including getting the technology just straight up on front to start creating carriers. Assuming you completed refit old ships, you'll get the deck conversions technology immediately, as well as a variant to start building them immediately, and all the tech boosts that come with it. Or on the flip side, with Modernize the Navy, you get a nice carrier hull with a carrier on the way. So basically you get to decide what kind of North Sea ambition big ships you really want to go for. Okay, I'll try and speed up through this because goodness knows we still have a political branch to get through, but we're on our way. So the Air Force branch is going to be, again, the kind of traditional choice that we always make between whether we want to have domestic designs or try and go for foreign licenses. Domestic designs works quite as you might expect by gaining some technology towards building your own planes, as well as helping you with your designer with the funds and size that we so commonly see now. But with foreign designs, they say there's going to be more of a connection with the international market regarding an equipment subsidy to Denmark for 1,000 CIC for close air support and fighters, depending on who you're trading with, Netherlands, UK, Germany or Sweden. It seems that the way the subsidy works is that as you're buying these pieces of equipment from the person who's selling it, whichever those four nations are, you're basically not going to have to pay as much. The difference is that the person who is selling it to you, UK, Germany or Sweden, they aren't receiving less. They still receive the same amount that they would have done anyway, it's just you as Denmark won't be spending as much. Everybody wins. I'll wrap up this section by saying that keeping in theme with the Army and Navy branch, eventually you can get this national spirit with all the focuses you've been working towards to give you some good buffs across the board. I note that none of them seem too try-hard, but there's a good amount of variety among them that in general you should feel a decent boost. Okay friends, you join me now at the political path, which is the final branch we're going to be talking about for this dev diary, and surprisingly it's like one of the shortest. But never mind, let's go take a look. So here we see, with a nice zoom in, the kind of focuses you're going down with the historical path. So following a policy of disarmament, we've got to choose between what seems like an industrial path for your government, as well as a more social path for your government. I guess following a policy of disarmament means you're not really going to be interacting with too many outsider contracts in this regard. You're kind of just going to be focusing on improving your nation, both industrially and socially. Following the industrial branch all the way to the bottom, you'll get yourself to full employment, which is a nice little focus, which gives you some push towards welfare, as well as improving that commonly reoccurring Danish industrial capabilities, minus 20% consumer goods factor. So that was kind of the main debuff I remember, which was coming up earlier, and it's good to see that all those factories are going to see some use. The dev diary does go back again though and remind you that in order to go down this branch, the historical branch, you're going to have to take the Declaration of Neutrality, which is going to give you what you can see before you. No joining factions, no sending volunteers. You can't guarantee anybody. You can't justify on anybody. It's just painful. You're not doing anything. The good news, however, and it's a very small caveat, but a very important caveat, is in the event that you are capitulated, or at least attacked, you get the option to become a puppet of that invading country and keep your government. This is because historically Denmark did surrender, as we know, very early on into the war, and so they were actually able to maintain some of their, let's say, political system as it stood, despite the fact they were under German occupation. And so here we see, as it is, Denmark still being a democratic nation, but as a Reichsprotectorate, under that painful puppet status. I wonder if they'll be able to start shipping off things to the Germans to try and boost their autonomy and maybe become independent again. What was hidden this entire time, though, is that following through this political branch, there will be the ultimatum of you being occupied, as is what happened historically, and therefore you get an occupation branch. So here we see, which is the traditional industry tree, But the political tree has gone and has been replaced by this occupation branch. In it, you're going to be working your best to try and gain as much autonomy while working with the foreign powers that are really trying to take down Germany to gain your independence and win back your freedom. With this branch, you're going to be doing things like aligning with the foreign powers, so that eventually you'll be able to declare your independence and go straight into being an ally of the Allies, I guess. In addition to that, you'll also have the opportunity to do things like create the Dan Force, although I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, Dan Force, or maybe the Dane Force perhaps, in which you can start prepping things in Sweden for eventual retribution, assuming that Sweden accepts to host our troops. Working in the shadows, you're going to start building up a national spirit called the, here we go, Motståndsbevegelsen. I am so sorry, in which you're going to get some attack bonus against the Germans, because goodness knows they need all the weakening they can get, as well as making sure that anything they're doing in our territory through their occupation is going to be worse and worse. The final section of the Dev Diary talks about how, remember the balance of power system that used to be the welfare versus warfare? It seems that when you're under occupation of the Germans, I guess it doesn't really matter as much anymore. And so what you're actually going to be doing is trying to destroy your overlord's influence by secretly prepping your nation for an uprising, especially should the Allies get a nice foothold on D-Day perhaps. With it comes a great series of decisions of things you can do, secretly coordinating strikes, sabotaging civilian industry, or maybe if you want to push yourselves working more towards Germany and being a little Kisling, a little toady, it seems that you also have those options available to you too. So, in short, that wraps up this week's Dev Diary. My reaction to the Denmark situation as it stands, it looks pretty okay. It looks better than Norway, but to be fair, I haven't seen enough of Norway, and I like the idea that there is a dedicated understanding of becoming a puppet and what would happen with like an autonomy branch and working towards your independent branch. I think that's a really good addition, because it basically makes a failure state system an entertaining way to play. Sometimes in HOI4 it can feel like when you lose, you just want to give up because you weren't playing for losing, but certain nations in the game, I feel, have really done well to make it a more entertaining experience. I think they did well with Poland, they did so with Ethiopia, and I see them doing it now with Denmark. So it's just more interesting ways to play the game. And of course, I am praying, A, that Greenland is releasable that we can play, but maybe something even more wholesome with like Bornholm becoming independent. Now that would be funny, and you just live on it, maybe. Who knows? Seems there are many state reworks, and even Germany itself is going to be having some state reworks. So I guess we might be looking at some of that later too. We have no information about what's coming next week, or if there even will be anything next week, so I can't give you any hints towards what's happening next time, but I will say, whenever I see you, thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, well, I guess you could like. If you wanted to, you could subscribe, and I will see you all next time. Bye.